All right, welcome back everybody. Hope you enjoyed having a little bit of a week off. So this week we are going to be getting away from some of the Constitution stuff, which is important, but sometimes it has a tendency to come across as being a little bit more motherhood and apple pie. And we're going to go ahead and get into the bylaws proper. Now, I know when we talk about getting into the bylaws, that can sound like it's really, really dull, but the reality is that the bylaws are, first of all, what keeps us grounded so that if there is some kind of conflict or something like that, you have something to go back to. But it also means that we kind of know in general how our church thinks. So you're really starting to get into the thought process of our church and how we address issues that may arise. Today, what we're actually talking about is bluntly how you get rid of me, or how you attach somebody to becoming a part of the pastoral team or something like that. The role of the pastoral team is something that is supposed to provide leadership and guidance for the church, not just administratively, but when it comes to the spiritual direction of the church. And as a church that is trying to be driven by where we feel God is calling us to be, that means that that role cannot be taken lightly. Being a senior pastor or an executive pastor or some other member of the pastoral team is very, very important to the direction that we feel God is calling us. Now you notice I'm calling it a pastoral team because it is in fact that. Remember that when we first put this church together and we were planning it, there were multiple individuals involved, and God willing, it will get back to something like that where there are individuals who feel called, more so than just being another servant in the church, but feel called in a manner that they feel like this is something that is actually driving them to take some sort of almost leadership type role. So for those individuals, you have the pastoral team. Now, what you end up seeing in the bylaws is in this first section that you have a team that is comprised primarily of a senior pastor, an executive pastor, and then other individuals as it may be deemed appropriate for whatever it is that we're doing. The way that an individual gets named to this team is they are brought up and there is an amount of voting that takes place when it comes to the elders as the individuals that are supposed to be the spiritual leadership of the church. If you want to separate an individual from the church, then either the individual themselves, the way we have it currently written, can identify that, hey, I want to separate from this church, and that can be voted on by the directors. Directors being individuals that are more of kind of like a legal appointee of the church. Or if an individual needs to be removed, we have a process of reconciliation. So we thought it was really important that separating a pastor from a church not just be something that can be voted on in a back room or something like that, that it's actually something that must be done up front with the individual. So that's kind of attaching and separating, and some of that specific language is there for you to be able to read if you want. But that's the main gist of it, is that we want there to be a mechanism to be able to add people onto the pastoral team, and we want there to be a way that everybody can agree on that you separate a pastor from the pastoral team if the need arises. Now, I mentioned a second ago that we have two main roles when it comes to the pastoral team, and that's the senior pastor role and the executive pastor role. Now, think of the senior pastor as being the individual that is that spiritual head of the church. It's an individual who feels called to shepherd, to protect, to guide, to nurture, to do those types of things that you think of when it comes to a shepherd of a flock. The executive pastor is the one that looks more at the operations of the church. So kind of this boring stuff like bylaws and everything, that's a very good example of what you would expect an executive pastor to do. So the senior pastor is responsible for providing a degree of oversight, but not oversight from a big brother perspective, but oversight from the perspective of trying to ensure that there is spiritual consistency across the different things the church does. Right now, it's pretty easy to see how we all stay on the same page, but you can imagine how as soon as we start getting a couple of home churches, maybe we have a Hispanic outreach church, we have the hub church, multiple Bible studies, pretty soon you start having a lot of different little pieces, and it becomes necessary to acknowledge that the senior pastor plays a role in bringing a degree of unity to all these different groups. Now, the executive pastor also has a role in unity, but it's more in terms of how things operate. Just making certain that things run smoothly, whether it comes to filing things with the state, whether it comes to looking at tax stuff, whether it comes to just how we run, little meetings and things like that. That's the role of that executive pastor. Now, obviously, in absence of having these different roles, it all kind of defaults to whoever's there. Right now, that's me. Once again, God willing, other people will be brought to us, or we will have other people be raised up, or whatever the case may be, and some of those people may grow into those positions. But right now, we think it's important to at least acknowledge that these different roles do exist, so that as we move forward, we can kind of see that pastors do play a certain role. And maybe that will also help us to understand why pastors are getting involved in one set of processes or another set of processes. So that was all kind of boring and kind of dry and everything, but just understand this. The role of a pastor in this church is to be what we see in 1 Timothy. It's to be an individual that helps to guide, that helps to teach, and that serves the individuals that are trying to grow deeper in their own faith with God. So with that being said, the question for all of us is, do our processes, as scant or as detailed as they may be, actually reflect the heart of a church that is led in that way? So that's what I have. I appreciate any feedback you have to offer. Look forward, as always, to hearing back from all of you. And thank you once again for your willingness to serve.